In this episode of the acoustic guitar build, we are going to be bending the sides. We're going to be making and gluing in the neck as well as the tail block, and we're going to get everything radiused to match the top and the back. Stick around. What's going on, and welcome back to another episode of Home Built Workshop. I hope you're doing awesome today. I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for asking. Anyway, it is another episode in the acoustic guitar build. My goal for today is to get the sides bent and into the mold, and as well as get the heel block and the neck block shaped and glued into place. That way it's going to connect the sides and I'll have sort of one solid piece. I'm waiting for the material for the sides to be delivered, and while I'm doing that I figured I might as well jump right in and make the neck. I keep calling it a neck block, but it's not. It's a heel block and the tail block. I want to call it the neck block and the heel block. I want to start shaping those now because, well, I don't want to waste time. That way when I get the side material, I can get it bent in the mold and then have these blocks already made. That way I can just glue them in and we can keep moving along. I'm going to use this chunk of mahogany. We're going to do a little bit of layout and make some cuts. I'm using my shooting board to square up the pieces and remove any of the marks left by the bandsaw. This part actually came out really good. Well, that wraps up my heel block and the tail block. Well, not really wraps up, but they are roughed out to size. And really, I enjoyed making these so much, I had to do it twice. Some of you may have noticed that already and realized that I'm making these with the grain direction going the wrong way. Yeah, I misread that on the plan, and yeah, let me show you what's going on. So when I laid these out originally on my piece of mahogany, I sort of misread or didn't really understand the grain direction that the plan was telling me. So I've got the grain going straight up through the piece. What that does is once you glue this surface to the sides, on the top and bottom where the top and the back of the guitar get glued, that's end grain, so you're not really going to get a good glue joint. What I needed to do was lay these out this way. That way the grain is going crossways like these. That way when you glue this on, you still have face grain, you still have edge grain here, face grain I guess, but your end grain is on the side. Nothing's getting glued to that end grain, so therefore you get a good glue surface on both sides. I guess really the lesson is grain direction is super important. I've said it before with the braces that you really need to pay attention for a project like this, which way the grain direction is going. Sometimes it gets a little confusing, but we're ready to keep going. I've got some 80 grit sandpaper stuck to the inside of my mold, and I'm just going to sand these blocks to exactly match the radius of my mold. I'm going to add a few pencil lines so I can see what I'm doing here. There we go. Pencil marks are gone. Looks like everything matches up. We'll just repeat that process for the tail block. I think that'll do. As I'm putting this video together here, I realized that I'm missing some footage. There's some additional shaping and contouring that I did to both of these blocks that I don't know where the footage went, but let me show you what else I did before we get back to this build. Now obviously this is after I've attached everything, so I'm coming at you from the future. But I wanted to show you that after I radiused the back edge of the block, I also contoured the front edge. This is really just aesthetic. Just added a couple of really large chamfers and then sanded the entire thing to 220. And here's the neck block. I did mostly the same thing, added a couple of chamfers on here, purely decorative, and then sanded the entire thing to 220 grit. And now back to your regularly scheduled guitar build. Hey, check it out. My sides have been delivered. What we have here are a couple of pieces of quarter sawn, nice straight grain Padauk. These are gonna look awesome. Now, I am not gonna be doing the bending for these this time around. My friend Matt over at Zimbelman Guitars has volunteered his fancy side bending machine to slap these things in and get them bent to shape. So we're gonna head over there and get these things bent. I'm gonna try to get enough footage to show you a good overview of the process. Now, just in case you're wondering why I'm not bending these sides here in the shop, well, the first reason is I don't own a bender, and until I'm ready to make that investment on a bender, benders are not all that cheap. Even those little irons are several $100s. I don't have one at this stage, and since this is my first build, I want to try to take advantage of all the resources that are available to give this project the greatest chance of success. So what do you say? Let's go bend some sides. Matt uses a template for his sides which is just a hair smaller than mine. Here I'm tracing his template, but I'm using a washer to offset the pencil line. Then we'll cut away the excess material on his bandsaw. As I've been researching and learning about this step of the build, I've seen a lot of people bend their sides just as a rectangle. I haven't really seen anybody do it exactly the way Matt does. Now, I'm sure there's some people out there, but I think this is a really good method. Since the back and the top are radius, there are going to be some areas of the sides where there's some excess material that needs to be removed. Now, I've seen a ton of people using little finger planes and chisels and stuff to carve that away, but the way Matt does it, this is the offcut from our sides. We've thinned it out where it needs to be, but there's a little bit more up here that's removed. This not only gives us a nice piece that we can make some purfling from, but there's a ton of excess material up here that we've now removed ahead of time. We don't have to spend time carving that away later when it comes time to radius and level everything to the neck and the tail block. So I think that's a good method. Now, I seem to have lost the footage of me cutting it on the bandsaw, but really, this is sort of what it looks like. Mostly the same thickness and the excess material removed off of this end. So let's jump to the drum sander. With that excess material trimmed away, we can now use the drum sander to bring these sides down to their final thickness. When I got the sides, they were a little over 120 thousandths thick, so by running them through the drum sander, we brought them down to 90 thousandths. To begin the bending process, first we sprayed the piece down with a spray bottle of water.
I think the thing that the problem is it mixes with all the resins and then it creates.
Then it gets wrapped up in some aluminum foil, which helps seal in the moisture. Our little foil packet of Padauk gets lined with a sturdy piece of spring steel. This just gives some support to the curves as we bend it, and followed by the heating blanket on top. Everything gets held in place with a couple of spring clamps, and this is ready to go into the bender.
I care where the waist is. This bender has been around the block.
The clamp at the waist of the jig gets tightened down first, and then the spring-loaded end clamps get brought down over the ends. The first side is in the bender. We'll just let it sit for a little while and see how it turns out. After letting the sides cook for a little bit, we pulled them out and quickly got it clamped into my mold. I didn't really film this because we were hurrying. There it is. These sides are in the clamps. We're gonna let this sit for a day. See how it turns out. Pretty exciting. Well, back here at the shop, I've let these sides sit securely clamped in the mold for plenty of time. The wood is completely dry. We're ready to move on. I gotta give a huge shout out to Matt over at Zimbelman Guitars for allowing me to come into his shop, use his tools, his equipment, and most of all, his side bending jig to get this done. Thanks a lot, man. If you guys wanna check out Matt's work, I'm gonna put a link down below in the video description. Now, before we glue the blocks in, we need to make sure that the sides are trimmed to length. Right now they're a little bit long and they overlap on both ends. At first I didn't think this technique was going to work with my set of molds, but since we've put the spreaders in here, it has opened up a small gap at either end. I can slip a flush trim saw right in the gap, and the gap will act as kind of a saw guide and allow me to cut both sides nice and flush at the same time. I think it's going to work pretty good. Before I start cutting, I'm going to slip a card scraper behind the piece that is over the other side. That way when I cut it loose, it's not going to spring down and risk breaking the sides. At least it'll be supported to where it's not going to allow this piece right here that is outside of the mold to break off. I'm pretty happy with that.
I'll just repeat that exact same process on the other side.
Since this is the first time doing this, I'm trying to go very slow, let the saw do the cutting, not put any weird pressure on this. I don't want to crack a side. It does make some weird creaking sounds. That kind of makes me a little bit nervous, but slow and steady. My cut could have been just a little bit straighter, but the gap up here is going to be covered by the neck, and any gap in the end is going to be covered by the end wedge, so a little gap is not a big deal. We don't have a whole lot of gap, but there is a little crookedness. It's going to be fine. And now we're ready to glue in these blocks, which will connect the two sides. Before I do that, I'm going to spend a fair amount of time getting this piece dry clamped in place. I've got center lines on the block that I'm going to line up with the center line on the mold as well as the center line of my two pieces. I'm going to spend a bunch of time getting it lined up, figuring out how I'm going to lay out my clamps, how I'm going to clamp everything up, and then we'll apply some glue. I think this is going to be an important step, and a lot of times I tend to skip a dry run, but on an operation like this, we're going to do it. Well, I think I've got my plan ironed out. Before we apply some glue, I've got some little pieces of scrap wood with some double-sided tape. I'm going to stick that on both sides of the block. That way it'll help keep the block from sliding around off of my center line once I apply the glue. You know how the pieces will slide around with glue on there? We don't want it to slide around, and by using these little pieces of scrap wood, it's going to hold it in place. We'll just pull them off once we have everything clamped securely. Now I can remove the block and place it right back in the exact spot. There's no way it can swim around in the glue. All right, let's glue this. Those pieces with the double-sided tape hold it right where it needs to be. All we need to worry about is the forward to back. Clamp it up. I've got a ton of different padded cauls here I'm going to be using to protect both the block and the sides. Now I'll remove these so they don't get glued to the sides. That made it really easy. Great tip, courtesy of Eric Schaefer. Well, is that not about the craziest thing of clamps you've ever seen? And since I've used most of my small clamps right now, I'm going to clean up this squeeze out and wait for this to dry for a while before unclamping it, and we'll repeat that exact same process for the neck block.
I don't want to forget to mention that I do have some parchment paper on the back side of the sides to prevent me from somehow gluing the sides to the mold. That wouldn't be fun.
There we go. Well, I have let this conglomeration of clamps dry overnight. We're ready to unclamp it. There goes that. Well, our block didn't fall out. Wow. Now we're ready to move on and finally put the radius on the top as well as the back. Now, since we trimmed these pieces and built the taper in originally, we don't have a whole lot of material to remove to level the sides with both of these blocks. Now, if we didn't do that, there would be a lot of excess material, especially on the neck block, where we would have to remove a lot to get it down flush with this block. I only have a tiny bit. I'm just going to use a chisel and very carefully level out both blocks with the sides. We have just a little bit of a lip here between the block and the sides. I probably could just sand this off of there, but I want to try to remove that with a chisel. Now I'm just going to add a little bit of chalk to the surface there. That way I can sand the sides exactly flush with the blocks, and when I remove the chalk, I'll know that I'm there. I'm going to do this exact same process on both sides and get them ready to hit the radius dish.
I'm just using a flat sanding block to sand the sides exactly flush with the blocks. Now I'll add some chalk all the way around, including the sides as well as the blocks. This is going to be a visual once we start sanding on the radius dishes.
Now I've got my 28-foot radius dish. We're just going to very carefully sand that radius into the top. Now I do know that some builders choose not to radius the top since we're using such a large radius. Some people use even up to a 50-foot radius, which is so shallow they're able to attach their tops without radiusing it, but for safety's sake, and since this is the first build, I'm going to radius the top. I'm just going to sand very carefully back and forth. I'm not going to put any downward pressure. I'm just going to let the weight of the mold, I'm going to check all the time to make sure I'm not sanding too far in one area or another. That's the reason for the chalk.
I guess this is the process otherwise known as driving the bus. Can you see the resemblance? I was trying to be very careful at the beginning as I was getting a feel for it, but overall, it's actually kind of fun.
So as expected, we're removing material here and here, as well as up here. We haven't gotten down far enough where we're getting into the waist or into the blocks. We want to keep going until we just remove the chalk from these blocks. And just to mix it up, I'm going to switch sides once in a while so that any irregularities of the sanding motion hopefully will be evened out. Oh, and since you guys last saw these radius dishes, I have added a second layer to the thickness. That way it keeps it a little bit flatter and a little bit sturdier. Something I probably should have done at the beginning, but we learn as we go around here. This bus driving's a lot of work. After a bottle of water and some sweating and a good workout, we're done. I'm gonna clean up this mess and we'll check it out. While we have both sides radius, the only thing I really had to do differently on the back was I did need to shift the position of the sides in the mold because it was a little too far down at this end. So I just scooted the mold up a little bit to give me some clearance while I was sanding. But we've got both sides radiused, ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be gluing in the kerfing as well as the bracing for the sides. That's going to be in the next episode of this build. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time.